Welcome, dear viewers. Today we'll dive into a world where there's no room for AI-generated fiction, only horrifying truths. Settle in, because we're about to explore the darkest corners of human nature. Please support my channel by liking and subscribing, and let's begin. Imagine this: 23 men and only one woman stranded on an uninhabited island. This is the premise of the Japanese film Tokyo Island, which was released in 2010. From the very beginning, this kind of story ignites genuine curiosity and even a sense of unease. After all, such unusual circumstances are rare, aren't they? But what's most surprising is that the film is actually based on real events that occurred in the past. Events that proved to be even more dramatic and cinematic than the film itself. It all began on a small island in the Pacific Ocean. Anahan Island, a tiny volcanic island located approximately 120 kilometers north of Saipan, part of the Mariana Archipelago in the Pacific, is barely 32 square kilometers in area. Its length from west to east stretches 9 kilometers, while its width is only 3.7 kilometers. To give a clearer picture of its size, one might say that this island is slightly smaller than Gangnam-gu, one of the districts in Seoul. The central part of Anahan is almost entirely engulfed in dense jungle vegetation, creating a feeling of total isolation from the outside world. In the 1940s, Anahan Island was under Japanese control. A company called Namyang operated here, managing an extensive coconut plantation that turned this small island into an economically significant site for Japan's interests in the region. At dawn on the 12th of June 1944, in the midst of the Pacific War, unexpected visitors arrived on the island, survivors of a maritime disaster. These survivors were Japanese sailors, young men recently drafted into the Japanese Navy. They were en route to Saipan, traveling on an aging fishing schooner when they suddenly came under fire from American forces. Miraculously, the battered boat, despite suffering significant damage, managed to carry them to the nearest island, which turned out to be Anahan. By then, the schooner was in such a sorry state that continuing the journey was completely out of the question. 31 people landed on the island. Among them were 10 Japanese soldiers and 21 conscripted sailors. All were men, most of them teenagers or very young adults, around 16 to 20 years old. These young men, who had yet to face the hardships of adult life, now found themselves thrust into the heart of war, far from home and in utterly unfamiliar surroundings. At the time, about 50 local residents lived on Anahan, forming a dynamic but secluded community. There were also only 2 Japanese nationals on the island, Mr. Ichiro Higaki, the manager of the coconut plantation, and his wife, Mrs. Kazu Higaki. Notably, the nature of Ichiro and Kazu's marriage was evident only from their shared surname, as Japanese tradition dictated that a wife always took her husband's family name. Although the survivors had reached the island, their situation was far from safe or peaceful. The war raged on, and tensions mounted to unbearable levels. The United States had focused its efforts on capturing Saipan, resulting in heavy regular bombings that targeted not only that island, but also the nearby territories, including Anahan. All remaining boats on Anahan were destroyed, leaving the island's residents and the new arrivals effectively trapped, with no means of escape. On this isolated island, surrounded by hostile seas and marked by the scars of war, 31 surviving Japanese sailors and about 50 local residents remained. They were young, full of vitality, and prepared to fight for survival. The first issue the survivors encountered was a simple yet crucial one: food. Initially, it seemed there was enough to go around, but soon it became clear they were consuming far more than they could afford. Within a month, all food stores on the island had run dry. The last pigs and chickens kept by the locals for food were gone. The Japanese were forced to rely on coconuts and bananas from the plantations, but these were insufficient. Soon, to survive, they began hunting wild lizards and even bats. In these conditions, conventional ways of making fire were impossible. To manage the cold nights and cook food, they resorted to ancient methods. Rubbing wooden sticks together, they created fire like primal humans stranded in a different era. Another long, grueling year had passed. By July of 1945, as the war neared its end, Anahan was subjected to yet another massive aerial assault by American forces. This marked a critical moment. American troops landed on the island and began rounding up its inhabitants. Seeing that they had no other choice, the locals chose to surrender. They joined the Americans, who offered them a chance to leave Anahan. The only way off the island was to board an American ship, which became their deliverance. However, for the 2 original Japanese residents of Anahan and the 31 recently arrived Japanese sailors, the Americans were still the enemy. To them, surrender felt like betrayal. So they chose to stay on the island, hiding deep within the jungles to avoid any contact with the American forces. As a result, Anahan was left completely devoid of its local population, with only the Japanese survivors remaining, turning the island into their final, desperate stronghold. On August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrendered, bringing World War II to an end at last. American forces, now in control of the captured territories, used loudspeakers to inform the remaining Japanese soldiers on Anahan of the war's end, urging them to cease their resistance and surrender voluntarily. But the Japanese on Anahan met this news with deep skepticism. They had no reason to trust the Americans' words. They were convinced that surrender meant certain death. This belief only grew stronger as deafening explosions echoed from nearby Saipan, close enough for the sounds to reach Anahan. In reality, the Americans were disposing of leftover bombs, but the Japanese were convinced these were signs that the fighting continued, a clear indication that the war was far from over. The sounds of explosions from Saipan became indisputable proof for the Japanese on Anahan. The Americans were lying, and the war was still ongoing. While the Americans made attempts to evacuate the remaining Japanese soldiers from the island, the situation grew more tense, and their persuasion efforts proved fruitless. Realizing that convincing them was hopeless, the Americans decided to leave them on Anahan, turning the island into a sealed trap for those who stubbornly refused to believe in the end of the war. A considerable amount of time passed. Gradually, the explosions ceased, the bombing stopped, and a silence fell over Anahan that had not been heard in a long time. Slowly, the Japanese came to the realization that the war had indeed ended. Bit by bit, they emerged from the jungles where they had been hiding and began to build a new life on the island, not as soldiers, but simply as survivors. Conditions on the island improved noticeably. The men took to farming, fishing in the sea, stockpiling food, and even learned to make alcoholic drinks from the coconuts growing on the plantations. Once their primary needs for food and safety were met, life began to settle and another instinct surfaced among the men, a sexual desire they could no longer ignore. There was only one woman left on Anahan, Kazuko Higa. She was believed to be Kikuchiro's wife, a belief held by all the men. However, persistent rumors soon began to circulate across the island. Kazuko and Kikuchiro were not in fact married as everyone had assumed. These rumors turned out to be true. For a long time, it was assumed they had a marital relationship, but it became clear that their bond was merely a facade, and their shared residence involved no obligations to each other beyond the mutual struggle for survival. Kazuko Higa was originally from Okinawa. In 1938, when she was just 15 years old, she met the man who became her true husband, Shoichi Higa, on the island of Saipan. He worked for the Namyang company, and shortly after their marriage, he was transferred to Anahan Island. At 18, Kazuko followed him, leaving her former life behind and starting anew on this remote island. On Anahan, Shoichi held a respectable position, but he had a superior, Kikuchiro Higa, who had already been living on the island when the couple arrived. The shared surname of Shoichi and Kikuchiro was purely coincidental, having nothing to do with their personal lives. In reality, Kikuchiro was her husband's supervisor, and Kazuko's relationship with him was strictly formal. Everything changed suddenly when one day Shoichi decided to journey to a neighboring island to meet and bring back his sister. It was at that very moment that the American bombings began, and all contact with Shoichi was lost. His whereabouts remained unknown, and despite all her efforts, Kazuko was unable to discover what had happened to him. She continued to wait and hope, but he never returned. Kikuchiro's family, her husband's superior, also lived on Saipan, and contact with them was lost as well, as though fate had swept them away into the unknown. Soon, Kazuko and Kikuchiro were the only two left on Anahan. But their peace was short-lived. The sudden arrival of Japanese sailors on the island startled Kazuko and awakened a sense of fear. She was now the only woman on the island, surrounded by young, lonely men, placing her in a potentially dangerous situation. To protect herself, Kazuko decided to rely on Kikuchiro, posing as his wife for appearance's sake. This act became her shield against the men's attention. She hoped that this facade would guard her against unwanted looks and actions. However, this decision led to a different kind of misfortune. Kikuchiro, who grew increasingly attached to Kazuko, gradually became obsessed with her. He began to resent even her simple conversations with other men, his jealousy escalating into rage. Kazuko had to endure his outbursts of anger and even violence. Eventually, the truth that they were not actually married came out, and word quickly spread across the island. Upon learning of her true status, the men's behavior toward her shifted. They openly expressed interest in her and sought her attention. The atmosphere on the island grew increasingly alarming and threatening for Kazuko. In August of 1946, a fallen American bomber was discovered deep in the jungle. Among the wreckage, 2 of the survivors found 2 pistols and 70 bullets. The appearance of firearms in such conditions, on an island cut off from the outside world, meant that those who possessed them held a disproportionate power over the others. From that moment on, a menacing tension settled over the survivors. Soon, a terrible tragedy struck the island. One of the men, whom we will call An, fell from a tree and died. Known within the group for his difficult personality, An had tense, even hostile relationships with the 2 men who possessed the pistols. After his death, dark rumors spread throughout the island. Maybe they killed An? Suspicion crept into the group, but the 2 armed men, who we'll refer to as the pair with pistols, ignored the gossip and began openly showing interest in Kazuko, the only woman on the island. Meanwhile, Kikuchiro, who had pretended to be Kazuko's husband and saw himself as her sole protector, realized his influence over the other men had weakened, especially in the presence of those who held weapons. Fearing for his survival, he submitted to these 2, offering them the right to share Kazuko, as if she were an object. This decision turned Kazuko's life into a living nightmare. She was forced to live with 3 men entirely against her will, with no means to defend herself from their control. Yet the tragedies didn't end there. In the fall of 1947, one of the 2 men with pistols was shot dead. The cause of the killing was never determined, but it was suspected that serious disagreements, possibly a struggle for control, had arisen between them. After this incident, Kikuchiro, the plantation manager and Kazuko's former husband, was consumed by fear. He wondered, "Am I next?" Terrified for his life, he left Kazuko with the remaining armed man and withdrew, avoiding any potential conflict. But not long after, the second armed man also met a tragic end, drowning while fishing. This was unexpected and inexplicable, given his skill as a swimmer and fisherman. His death once again shifted the balance of power on the island, sparking a new wave of uncertainty and fear among the survivors. Kazuko, left unprotected, returned to Kikuchiro, as she couldn't bear to be alone. She needed some form of support and security. At this point, only 27 men and 1 woman, Kazuko, remained on the island. The pistol left behind by the second man's death passed into the hands of yet another person, but even that didn't stop the string of mysterious deaths. Soon after, Kikuchiro died, and the circumstances surrounding his death became a new enigma. Kazuko claimed he had died from food poisoning, but many on the island doubted her words, suspecting that something more sinister might be hidden behind his death. If you think about it, it seems unbelievable. Yet the fact remains, every man who came close to Kazuko ultimately met his end. And this fatal cycle didn't stop even after Kikuchiro's death. The next man to inherit the pistol also perished soon after, swept away by a massive wave while out at sea. The situation on the island took on an ominous turn. Each man who possessed the weapon and stayed close to Kazuko seemed destined for doom. This string of deaths fueled more and more talk, and superstitions on the island grew rampant, as if Kazuko herself were a harbinger of misfortune. Of the original 31 men stranded on Anahan, only 23 remained. At this point, an unexpected shift took place on the island. Realizing the futility of their situation and the danger of endless conflict, the men made a surprising decision. They threw the pistol into the sea, symbolically rejecting the source of power and division. To restore peace and order, they proposed that Kazuko choose a husband of her own, one she truly wanted. Moreover, they agreed that no one else would bother her, no matter how strong their personal desires. For the first time, it seemed as if the island could experience a long-awaited peace. But this harmony was deceptive. Before long, tensions flared again as the men began quarreling over Kazuko, rekindling disputes that only worsened the situation. No agreements could suppress the mounting tension, and with no way to resolve their frustrations, the men sought an explanation for their misery. Gradually, a strange yet overpowering belief took hold among them. All the misfortunes, all the deaths surrounding them, were caused by Kazuko. The men began to blame her, as if she were the source of a curse, and soon this led them to a horrifying decision. They concluded that Kazuko had to be executed to end their suffering once and for all. Kazuko, left with no choice but to fight for her life, realized she had to escape or face certain death. In June of 1950, she made a desperate move. She sought help from the Americans, sending out a distress signal. She fully understood that surrendering to the Americans could also mean danger. After all, she had grown up thinking of them as the enemy, but this was her only hope for survival. At 30 years old, she was finally taken into American custody, gaining the long-awaited freedom she had all but given up on. After her release, Kazuko returned to her native Okinawa, but the weight of her past still clung to her. She shared the news that Japanese survivors remained stranded on Anahan, cut off from the world. By the spring of 1951, an active campaign in Japan had begun to rescue those left behind. Families of the survivors, learning of their loved ones' fate, gathered and sent letters that were delivered to Anahan via leaflets. Knowing that the Japanese on the island might distrust strangers, they reached out through these family members, hoping to establish contact and convince them it was safe. Relatives and friends tried to communicate the truth of the war's end, hoping this would bring them home. At first, none of the Japanese on Anahan believed the messages. Even when they saw leaflets with appeals from relatives, they suspected it might be a trick, a trap set by the Americans to capture them. They hid in the jungle once more, fearing deception. But over time, one of the men recognized his family's handwriting on a leaflet, and this small detail changed everything. He decided to emerge from hiding and reach out to the rescue team. His actions inspired others, who slowly began to accept the truth. The war had indeed ended. Gradually, one by one, they came out of the jungle, realizing that the long years of fear and doubt were finally over. In July of 1951, the remaining Japanese on Anahan Island were evacuated and flown home on an American aircraft. By then, only 20 men had survived. Once they returned home, Japanese authorities launched an investigation to uncover what had happened during their years of isolation. In every man's account, Kazuko was an essential figure. What especially stood out was a mysterious pattern. Every man with whom she had lived on the island had died. This fact immediately drew the attention of the press, and soon Kazuko's story became a national sensation. The media dubbed her the Queen of the Island Kazuko, and she became the subject of widespread public fascination. As time passed, the story grew more exaggerated. In their quest for a sensational headline, newspapers began publishing unconfirmed rumors that Kazuko had supposedly chosen men deliberately to use them for her survival. Outsiders painted her as a cold-blooded femme fatale, a manipulator and seductress. Yet the reality was much darker. Kazuko had never chosen partners of her own will. She was a victim of circumstance and coercion, an object of desire and rivalry among men who were vying for dominance and power. All those close to Kazuko were the leaders of the group, which inevitably made them targets for other men eager to claim the top position. Kazuko herself became a casualty of the ruthless struggle for power and survival. But Japanese society at the time, instead of empathizing with her suffering, focused on her alleged sexual role, turning her into a symbol of temptation and seduction. She was quickly labeled a femme fatale, and even after returning home, she continued to face mockery, accusations, and condemnation. The irony of fate is that Kazuko's tragic story unexpectedly brought her fame. Films were made, books were written, and her image became associated with mystery and allure. Her photographs sold like those of a celebrity. Yet the public's fascination was short-lived, and soon it faded, allowing Kazuko to finally find peace. She married and was able to return to the life she had longed for. A simple, quiet existence, far from the scrutiny and suspicions that had haunted her since her time on Anahan. Her long-awaited peaceful life, however, was brief. In 1974, Kazuko was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and at just 49 years old, her life came to an end. The story of Anahan Island remains a stark reminder of what happens when primal instincts and human fears collide under conditions of isolation and brutal inequality. It feels like the plot of a film, yet reality proved far harsher and more dramatic. I am personally struck by the fact that all of this truly happened. When I first heard of Kazuko, the story seemed like mere sensationalism, a legend of a woman surrounded by men on a deserted island. But once you learn the details, it becomes clear. Kazuko was an unwilling victim of circumstances, trapped in a situation from which there was no escape. Not only Kazuko, but the local residents and all the other survivors on Anahan experienced horrors as well. They became casualties of someone else's war, a war they neither wanted nor understood. This story is a bitter reminder that every war is a tragedy for those who are unwillingly swept into its grasp. We must remember this story to prevent such tragedies, born of war, from ever happening again. Stay tuned. The second story is coming up and it will make you think even more. What are your thoughts on the first story? Let me know in the comments. I'm really curious to hear your opinion. April 27th, 2008, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Hong Kong. 17-year-old Wang Jam leaves her home with a brief, "I'm off to work," to her parents. However, that day, the girl vanished without a trace. Her worried parents contacted the police only 2 days later on April 29th. Since Wang Jam was a minor, the police immediately classified the case as an abduction and began questioning the family. Right from the start of the investigation, the officers had questions. First, why did the parents raise the alarm only 2 days after their teenage daughter disappeared? Second, none of the family members knew exactly what kind of side job the girl was doing. The parents explained that Wang Jam had occasionally stayed over at friends' places before, so they hadn't been concerned about her absence. However, 2 days without contact was a first. When asked about the nature of her part-time job, the parents answered evasively. She worked somewhere to make some pocket money. What exactly she did, we don't know. The parents' indifference struck the police as odd. To locate Wang Jam and uncover what kind of work she was involved in, investigators decided to closely examine her computer, hoping to find any clues. Their efforts paid off. They were particularly intrigued by a suspicious online platform where Wang Jam was registered. It wasn't long before the police discovered that the girl had been involved in compensated dating, essentially providing sexual services for money. In essence, it is akin to prostitution, but dating sounds less vulgar and attracts many women in Hong Kong looking for easy money. Especially alarming was the fact that compensated dating had become widespread among teenagers. Online platforms that facilitate the organization of such dates do not require complicated registration procedures. All that's needed is to upload a photo, list interests and hobbies, and write a brief description about oneself. Interested parties can contact each other directly through the platform. Wang Jam registered on the site under the username Kimmy. Due to the lack of proper oversight on these sites, the involvement of minors in prostitution is rampant. When her parents learned about their daughter's activities, they categorically denied her involvement in anything like that. However, the reaction of Wang Jiamei's older sister was completely different. She became noticeably nervous, avoided eye contact, and seemed deeply uncomfortable. Finally, gathering her courage, she confessed, "My sister was involved in this, but only briefly, just for a little while to help the family financially." Wang Jiamei had a secret she couldn't share with anyone. She was born in China, where she experienced abuse and neglect from her biological father as a child. When she was 3 years old, her mother took the daughters and left home. In 2005, her mother met a man from Hong Kong, married him, and the whole family moved to Hong Kong. Wang Jiamei was 14 years old at the time, a difficult transitional age. Fortunately, she quickly adapted to her new life. She made friends at school, did well academically, and was considered a model student. However, at home, the situation remained tense. Wang Jam couldn't get along with her stepfather, often clashing with him. As a result, she began spending more and more time away from home and her grades started to slip. One day, Wang Jam suddenly told her sister, "I'm dropping out of school and will start making money to help mom." The family's financial situation was difficult. Hong Kong is known for its high cost of living and poor living conditions. The mother worked as a cleaner and did everything she could to support the family, but the money was still not enough. Wang Jam decided to contribute to the family budget. Her mother was categorically against it. She dreamed that her daughter would study hard and get into a prestigious university. However, reality was harsh. "You can't drop out of school, you need to study," her mother constantly repeated. The conflicts with her parents weighed heavily on Wang Jam, and she continued down her path of self-destruction. During this time, she learned about compensated dating, which was popular among her peers. The opportunity to quickly earn money by spending time with men was too tempting. Eventually, she took a step into the dark world. On the day of her disappearance, April 27th, Wang Jam logged into the dating site. The police focused on Wang Jia's chat correspondence and summoned a man named Ding Chi-tai for questioning. 24-year-old Ding owned a figurine shop and was the last person to have seen Wang Jam. When asked about that day, he responded evasively, "I don't remember well." However, he did share the following. The day before, on April 26th, he had been at a club where he consumed alcohol and a larger-than-usual dose of ecstasy. Ecstasy is a drug that stimulates the central nervous system and causes hallucinations. That night, Ding Chi-tai was extremely drunk and under the influence of drugs, and the next day he was still not fully recovered. At some point, he logged onto the online platform, where he came across Wang Jia's profile. Her photo caught his attention, and soon they met in person. Ding Chi-tai claimed that due to his condition, he remembered almost nothing about the meeting with Wang Jam. Such limited information raised even more suspicion. Based on Ding Chi-tai's testimony, the police were able to trace the address of the hotel where the two had met. In the room they rented, important evidence was found: blood traces on a chair and the bathroom curtain. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Wang Jam. Thus, in the room where the man and the missing girl had been, traces of the missing girl's blood were found. Ding Chi-tai went from being a witness to the prime suspect. At first, Ding Chi-tai behaved arrogantly, insisting that he remembered absolutely nothing due to the alcohol and drugs. He even pounded on the table, feigning despair and complete innocence. However, when he was informed about the traces of Wang Jia's blood found in the hotel room, his behavior changed dramatically. He then claimed that he and Wang Jam had taken drugs together in the room, and in the morning, he found her dead. Ding Chi-tai feared he would be accused of murder. Of course, if he were not involved in the girl's death, he would have immediately called the police. But there were things holding him back: the joint drug use and the fact that Wang Jam was a minor and involved in prostitution. So he decided to dispose of the body. He admitted to hiding the body but adamantly denied committing the murder. It was a classic criminal tactic. However, the police didn't fall for this and forced Ding Chi-tai to tell the full truth. So, what really happened? In the hotel room, Ding Chi-tai and Wang Jam took drugs together. Ding Chi-tai, already in a state of extreme excitement worsened by the ecstasy he had taken the day before, began to experience auditory and visual hallucinations, and panic set in. At that moment, he couldn't control his aggression. He attacked Wang Jam and began to strangle her. She tried to resist, but she was no match for him. Wang Jam suffocated. Realizing he had committed murder, Ding Chi-tai panicked and decided to cover up the crime. His actions were cold-blooded and decisive. He went to a supermarket where he bought everything he needed to dismember the body. Returning to the room, he began the horrific process. The body was divided into 3 parts: head, bones, and flesh. He ground up the internal organs and flushed them down the toilet. He wrapped the head in a towel and placed it in a bag, while the bones were thrown into the sea. What Ding Chi-tai did with the flesh was particularly cynical. He called a butcher shop and offered them pork. The dismembered remains of Wang Jam, disguised as pork, were delivered to the shop at a local market. To avoid suspicion, he mixed the remains with real pork. The question arises, how did the butcher not notice the substitution? When the police discovered this fact, they immediately headed to the market. "Do you still have the meat that was delivered to you that day?" they asked the vendor. But the meat had already been sold, and no trace of Wang Jam could be found. How could someone confuse human flesh with pork, even if they're not an expert? Doesn't this suggest the butcher's involvement in the crime? During questioning, the butcher swore he knew nothing and was simply selling what had been delivered to him. However, the public in Hong Kong was skeptical of his claims. Many believed that he might have suspected the origin of the meat but remained silent out of greed. Be that as it may, the fact remains. Someone purchased human flesh from that butcher shop. The police continued searching for any part of Wang Jiamei's body. Despite Ding Qitai's confession, physical evidence was still needed to formally charge him. Investigators combed through the area where Ding Qitai claimed to have discarded the bones, but storms and strong waves hampered the search efforts. The next focus of the investigation was the hotel. On May 9th, the police extracted a large amount of waste from the sewer and septic system. Suspicious materials were collected and sent for forensic examination. The volume of material gathered amounted to 30% of the total waste. A race against time began. If no trace of Wang Jiamei was found among the waste, all efforts would have been in vain. After long and excruciating hours of waiting, the forensic results finally arrived. Skin fragments and bone pieces were found in the waste. This was the long-awaited news. Additionally, parts of fingers and what was presumed to be Wang Jiamei's skull were also discovered. The police rejoiced, having found irrefutable evidence, but the girl's relatives could not share in this joy. Despite all the efforts, Wang Jiamei's head was never recovered. Thanks to the discovered evidence, Ding Qitai was charged with the murder of Wang Jiamei. In July 2009, after 2 months of trial proceedings, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Ding Qitai tried to seek leniency, citing his voluntary confession. However, the brutality of the crime left him with no chance. It seemed that with Ding Qitai's life sentence, the case was closed. However, the story had a continuation. The fact that Wang Jiamei's remains were sold in a butcher shop sparked mass panic among Hong Kong residents. People who had purchased meat from that shop were horrified by the thought that they might have eaten human flesh. Sales at the market dropped by half, and restaurants and bars in the surrounding area were left empty. Ding Qitai is still in prison. In 2011, he was punished for attacking another inmate, which once again proves that some people cannot be changed. The tragedy of Wang Jiamei made the people of Hong Kong reflect on the issue of compensated dating. According to experts, children from troubled families like Wang Jiamei's are more likely to seek love and attention. When combined with the opportunity to make money, it becomes difficult for them to resist temptation. Of course, not all children from difficult backgrounds are at risk, but it is crucial to prevent such tragedies. Adults must pay attention to children who lack love and support and help guide them away from dangerous paths. In conclusion, I would like to express condolences to the family and friends of Wang Jiamei, whose life and dreams were so cruelly cut short.